Hey, this is Chris and welcome to Coding in Public. Today we've got another image gallery we're going to work on. This one has a few cool features. When you hover over these, you see you've got this little zoom in icon and our cursor, you click on that and now you've got these arrows that you can click and then they disappear when you get to the last one. And you can also use your keyboard arrows and transition that way. And we can set it up to where when you're on the final one on the left, you click left and it'll actually jump to the furthest one on the right. We're going to set this up over a couple of videos, and today we're going to work primarily on HTML and CSS, and then in the future we will work on JavaScript. All right, let's jump right in. Okay, I've got basically nothing going on here. I've got this index.html page in the CSS that just has a basic clear, a font family we've pulled in, and then basically just is going to say, hey, put everything in the center. So that's what we've got going on so far. Now what we're going to do is come in here on the body and go ahead and start adding in our HTML. The first thing we're going to do is add our H1 tag that says something like click a mountain. I dare you. All right, next we're going to come in here and we are going to add our grid container. That will be where our images live. So we'll just do grid container. And inside here we were going to have 6 images. So I'll do image times 6. Well, I guess let's put a class on these. Let's call them Lightbox enabled. And we want 6 of those. All right, so for these, what we're going to do is we're just going to grab them from our images folder. And I've got a few different types of images here. We've got image 1, those are just the large images. And then I've got these small images. Now, if we load them as small images here, this means we can keep these images as small as they need to be. So when they first load, they only take up as much space as they need to, as far as the network request. And then we can just load the larger image when we actually load that light box. So we'll come in here and we're going to add something like, these are mountains. And then we are going to add a data attribute called images src, which is just a made up attribute. You can add your own attributes to things as long as you add data dash to the front of them. And then we'll come in here and say images, and then we'll just going to do image 1. Actually, I'm going to erase these and just copy this down 5 more times. I think that should be the easiest. And then I'll come in here and select both of these by holding the Option key and then go 2, come down here, go 3, come down here and go 4, 5, and 6. Okay, so we've got all of them laid out there like we need them. All right, next we're going to actually create the Lightbox container and put it on the page. So we'll just call that Lightbox container. And inside there we will have a Lightbox image wrapper, another div, and then finally inside here we're going to have 3 things. We're going to have the buttons for either side of the image and then the actual image area for that light box. So we'll say button. We're going to call this, give it a class of light box button, and then another class of left and an ID of left. Now inside this button, we're going to add an SVG, and I've just copied the code over here already, but it's essentially just a left arrow. And then we will come in here and add another image, and this one we're just going to call Lightbox image. And right now the source is going to be set to nothing. The alt will be mountains, all right, because we know that's what it'll be. One more time, we're going to come in here and say we're going to have a button that has a Lightbox button and a right class this time, and then an ID of right. And once again, I've got just the SVG text to paste in there. You'll notice it shows up just like you'd expect. Because there's no image right now, it just says mountains, and that's because that's our alt tag. All right, so that is all the HTML we're going to need, I think. Let's go ahead and jump over to the CSS. All right, we've already got some stuff kind of laid out here for us. But really all we've done is say, hey, take everything that's inside the body, which right now is everything lives, either this H1 or lives inside this grid container or Lightbox container, and it's basically just smashing them all here in the center. Okay, so now let's actually do some more interesting things. Let's grab that H1, and we're going to say padding of like 2 rem, 1.5 rem on the sides, and 0 down below. And we're going to text align this center so it stays in the center of the page. And let's actually add some variables up here on the root. Let's do something like primary color, and we'll do this as 08417D. And that's the color we're going to use here. So we'll say color var, and these are just standard CSS variables. And you'll see it turns that color. And so that way we can just change it once here and it'll update all over our page wherever we're using that color. All right, next, and let me zoom in just a little bit more here. Let's go ahead and pull up the grid container. Remember, that's what's holding all of our images. We're going to do display of grid. And then let's go ahead and lay those out in columns. So we'll do grid template columns. And we can repeat and have a repeating pattern here and do auto fit, min max, 250 pixels, and 1 fraction. What that's going to do is say, hey, give me as much as you can fit at 250 and then space them out. Now, right now it's not working because we actually need to make sure that this takes up the maximum width allotted here. So 100% width. And now as we move it, it'll try to take 250 pixels, and if it'll fit however many it can in using that auto fit for the columns. All right, next let's add a grid gap here. So let's say grid gap of 1 rem and then a padding of 2.5 rem. Okay, that places everything in the middle. Now we've got those images in there, and I think we just called them Lightbox enabled. Is that right? Lightbox enabled, yep. So Lightbox enabled, those are the images themselves. We'll say width of 100% and object fit of cover. Now, when we hover over these, I'm going to refresh here. When we hover, we want them to actually change colors and or to kind of grow in opacity or lessen in opacity, I guess. So let's come down here. Let's get a little more space. And we'll say Lightbox enabled hover. And here we're going to say opacity of like 0.9, 0.8, something like that. So now if we come over here, you'll see that they change in opacity. Now, we actually want that to transition. And so we'll say transition all of like 250 milliseconds, ease in and out. In fact, let's go ahead and make this a variable too, so we don't have to keep using it throughout. So we'll just say transition, and we'll set it to that, and then come down here and say var transition. Okay, so now when we come in here, this should kind of pull in and out as we hover over these. All right, we also want to update the cursor when we hover over this. So we'll say cursor is going to be zoom in. That'll give you that little magnifying glass so that people know they can click and open it up and zoom and see it bigger. And lastly, let's say transform scale of 1.01. So it'll also just slightly kind of grow bigger as you come over the top of it. And there we go. Okay, let's now come in here and say, let's grab that Lightbox container. Now, that's actually this final div down this way, but we want to pull it out of the flow of the document. So we're going to say positioned of fixed. And you see it's just pulled all the way up there. But now what we want to do is we want to say the min width will be 100 view width, and the min height will be 100 view height. And to make sure that we can see what's going on here, let's do a background color of like red. Okay, so now you see how abysmal that is, but there we go. All right, the next thing we want to do is say display of grid here, and then place item center, just like we did on our body. And that will put everything directly in the center here, which eventually, once we have a picture, that'll look just how we want it to. We'll do a padding of 1 rem, and then make sure it always is going to sit on top of everything. So we'll do something ridiculous like z-index 1000. Because we've got this position fixed, it'll pull it up as all the way above everything else that's normal z-indexed. Now, in order to hide this, first of all, let's go ahead and set this background color to something else. Let's set another variable up here. We're going to call it light faded. We'll say RGBA 255, 255, and 255. That's white, but we'll do 50% of that. So maybe let's call this white faded. All right, now let's come down here and change this to var and white faded. Now, there's several ways we could hide this. We could do display none, but then add a display grid later when we click. But I think the way I'd like to do it so we can kind of have a transition between the two is actually set this to opacity of 0. Now, I still can't click on anything here. You see my cursor isn't even changing. And that's because we still have pointer events on. So we can say pointer events of none. And then let's do transition. And we're going to use that same transition. And we're going to add a class in JavaScript. So we'll say Lightbox container. And the class we're going to add is called active. And when that one is on, we're going to want it to be opacity 1 and pointer events of all. Let's just come in here and go ahead and inspect this. And we've got this Lightbox container. If I come in here and add an active class, you see it pulls up there and transitions off. And then if I remove that active class, it pulls off and kind of transitions out of that. And that's what we want. All right, next let's actually grab the Lightbox image wrapper. That's the thing that holds that whole section. Let's change this back to 1 so we can see it. It's what holds these arrows and that image itself. So we'll say Lightbox image wrapper. And again, we're going to do a display grid and a place item center. We'll do max width of 90 view width. And max height of 90 view height. That just ensures it doesn't take up the entire screen when it opens up. All right, next we want to position these buttons as absolute positioning. So in order to keep it inside this image wrapper, we actually need to have here position of relative. And then behind the whole area, we want a box shadow. So let's say box shadow of 3 pixels, 3 pixels. That's left and right, up and down, and then 10 pixels is the blur. And then let's set another variable up here. We'll call this dark faded, and this will be 100, 100, 100. That's like a dark gray and like 40%, something like that. And you can see it showing up there. Well, I guess we didn't set it yet, so it's actually just pulling in dark, I think. So let's go ahead and save it here. Yeah, and it backs off just a bit. All right, that looks a little better anyhow. We've just got a little bit left. We have those buttons. Let's go ahead and say those buttons should have a background color, and they're going to have that light or that white faded there. And next we want to say display grid, and this allows us to put everything once again into the middle. So we can set the image inside the middle of that button. And we'll do a padding of like 0.8 rem. So they're a little bit larger there. For the color, we'll do a var primary. So the actual text itself is a little different. Now, the reason we can set the color of those SVGs is because we added it inline here, and we have the stroke set to the current color. And so we can actually control the color then with CSS. Next, we're going to come in here and say we want the cursor to be a pointer. So when we hover over it, we get that pointer. And then lastly, let's go ahead and set the transition. And we're going to use our same transition variable. Whenever we hover on them, we want them to move certain ways. And we'll do that for the left and right differently. But setting that transition on the button itself allows us to set that once and then get the side effect or the effect kind of no matter which button we hover over. Let's come down here and say button focus. And because we're going to do a few things here, we can go ahead and turn off this outline altogether so that it won't show that blue box around it. And we're going to indicate which button is being focused another way. All right, now we gave classes to those. And I'm trying to remember what those classes were. If we come down here, Lightbox button. That means we should probably change these out for Lightbox button. Before we do things for the left or the right individually, let's go ahead and make sure that both buttons are set to be position of absolute. Now to make this a little easier to see, let's come back to our index.html and let's actually add some kind of source here just so we can see what's going on. So let's go images and we'll just grab that first image. All right, now we'll have to fix that eventually so we can see what's going on here. Maybe let's do that now. So we'll grab that Lightbox image and set it to a width of 100%, an object fit of cover, and a cursor of zoom out. Now, right now we've got pointer events turned off on all this, so it's not going to show us anything because the entire container here, the whole Lightbox container, has all pointer events off. But at least we can actually see kind of what's going on here in this area. We'll come back and style that a little bit more here in a moment, but for now let's go ahead and do a little bit more for these Lightbox buttons. Now on that left one, we want to grab that and say we want it left of like 5 pixels. So it'll move it all the way over. And we're going to do the same thing for the right one, except here we're going to move it right 5 pixels. Now this image should be staying in the middle. Let's make sure that we added a class to this. Lightbox image. All right, is that the same thing we've got over here? Okay, so this should be image here, and now it pulls right in the middle for us. Okay, so we've got that set up. We just want to add a few other things, some hover and focus effects, and then I think we're done with the HTML and CSS. So we're going to come in here and we're going to say whenever it's left and it has a hover, or whenever it's left and it has focus, then we want left to be 0. So if we come in here and come over here now, let's go ahead and turn off our pointer events of none, so that when we come in here, it should just pull right over just that way. Okay, and then we're going to do the same thing here below for the right. And we should have selected that one too, right of 0. So we come over here, both of those fade, everything changes like it's supposed to. And now finally, let's come back up this way, remove these pointer events, and set this opacity to 0. Okay, so we've got the basic HTML and CSS, I think, mostly done. There might be 1 or 2 things we need to do later, but you'll see if I were to remove these here, it will show this Lightbox container, and we should be able to, we'll set up the functionality to click here, but as we hover, they move to indicate we can kind of go one direction or the other. We will need to add an inactive class eventually here for these because we're going to remove the one when it gets all the way over. So I guess let's go ahead and do that. I'd forgotten about that. So let's just come here and say, where's our button? So we'll say Lightbox button dot inactive, which will be the class we add. We'll move it to opacity of 0 and pointer events of none. So that when we put a class of inactive on this, it'll make this disappear, or it'll make this disappear, depending on which one we want to hide. All right, so that's all the HTML and CSS. If you like this, go ahead and hit that like button. All right, thanks so much and happy coding.